3,000 feet below the South China Sea. Something sits perfectly upright in the darkness that shouldn't exist anymore. The USS Harter. The submarine that terrorized Japanese destroyers for 2 relentless years rests exactly where it died 79 years ago, with all 79 crew members still sealed inside. When the Lost 52 Project's autonomous underwater vehicles first captured images of the wreck in 2024, maritime archaeologists struggled to process what they were looking at. They expected a shattered hull, scattered debris, and ruptured chambers. Instead, they found a vessel eerily preserved, as if frozen in the moment of its final battle. The conning tower rises straight up from the seabed like a monument deliberately placed there, untouched by time. The radar mast stands in the same offset position to starboard described in the 1944 blueprints. Even the ammunition lockers under the forward gun deck remain sealed, their contents undisturbed since the day the Harter slipped beneath the waves. But what unsettled the researchers wasn't just the state of the submarine. It was the realization that something else still waited inside. 8 decades of darkness have preserved not just metal and machinery, but the final moments of 79 men whose last decisions remain locked behind steel compartments. The question isn't how the Harter was found. With modern sonar, deep-sea vehicles, and persistent researchers, discovery was inevitable. The real question is what we still fear to learn from what lies sealed inside a submarine that changed the course of the Pacific. War and then vanished in circumstances that remain incomplete, inconsistent, and deeply unsettling. Because when you analyze the damage patterns, when you trace the points where Japanese depth charges tore into the hull, you realize something chilling. The crew had time. Not much, but enough to act, enough to try something, enough to communicate. Which means the final minutes aboard the Harter weren't instant chaos. They were deliberate, desperate, human. And somewhere inside that wreck are the last untransmitted words of a commander who broke every rule of submarine warfare and lived long enough to know the odds had finally reversed. The USS Harter wasn't just another submarine patrolling the Pacific. When it slid off the ways at the Electric Boat Company in Groton, Connecticut in August 1942, it appeared identical to the other Gato-class submarines being mass-produced for the war effort. It had the same triple-banked diesel engines, the same electric motors, the same 10 torpedo tubes, the same capacity for long-range patrols. But machines don't become legendary by design alone. They become legendary because of who commands them and how they're used. When Commander Samuel David Dealey took command, the Harter went from a standard submarine to a weapon that defied naval doctrine. In 1943, every submarine captain knew one rule: avoid destroyers at all costs. Destroyers were the apex predators of the oceans, fast, maneuverable, loaded with depth charges, and equipped with sonar that could track a submarine even in pitch-black waters. Standard operating procedure dictated that if a submarine spotted a destroyer, it dove deep, ran silent, and prayed to go unnoticed. Dealey shattered that rule. He developed a tactic so audacious that other submarine commanders initially dismissed it as suicidal. Instead of fleeing from destroyers, he turned toward them, maneuvered directly into their approach path, and fired torpedoes head-on. It was called the Downthor attack, and it flipped the psychology of a naval warfare. Japanese destroyer captains who believed themselves the hunters suddenly realized they were the hunted. The tactic wasn't luck. It was mastery of timing, precision, and nerve. During the Harter's Second War Patrol in August 1943, Dealey sank 5 merchant ships, totaling more than 25,000 tons. But it wasn't the number of ships that astonished Naval Command. It was the way the attacks were carried out. While other submarines fired 1 torpedo and then dove to avoid counterfire, the Harter often stayed near the surface, watched the torpedo hit, then surfaced fully to use its deck guns to finish off crippled targets. They painted the words "Hit M. Harter" on the conning tower. Sailors on other submarines whispered about the Harter the same way fighter pilots spoke about Ace's half admiration, half disbelief. By early 1944, Japanese intelligence had identified the Harter as a priority target. Destroyer crews received explicit orders: find the aggressive American submarine and eliminate it. But Dealey didn't retreat into caution. He became even more assertive. On the 4th patrol in March 1944, the Harter did the unthinkable. It attacked the destroyer Ikazuchi head-on at point-blank range, sank it, then surfaced under a threat of air attack to rescue an American pilot. The men operated under fire with the calm efficiency of a drill, proving that the Harter's crew wasn't reckless. They were disciplined, coordinated, and exceptionally trained. Naval historians still debate what made the crew push themselves harder than regulations recommended. They undertook longer patrols, engaged more targets, and repeatedly volunteered for high-risk missions. Something was driving them, something beyond duty. By the spring of 1944, Dealey and his crew had already exceeded the number of consecutive combat missions most submarine commanders were allowed. Yet when the Pacific Fleet needed volunteers for a near-suicidal assignment, tentering waters, swarming with enemy destroyers, to disrupt Japanese operations before the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Harter volunteered without hesitation. The 5th Patrol began on May 26, 1944. The mission: penetrate one of the most dangerous stretches of ocean in the world and directly attack destroyers protecting Admiral Jizaburo Ozawa's fleet at Tawi-Tawi. Most submarine commanders would have attempted cautious, stealthy approaches. Dealey stayed aggressive. On June 6, 1944, the same day, Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy. The Harter encountered the destroyer Minazuki. Dealey didn't wait for nightfall or attempt a submerged approach. He ordered a full-surface attack in broad daylight. The Minazuki, confident in its superior speed and firepower, closed in. That was exactly what Dealey wanted. At 1,000 yards distance so close, any miscalculation meant death. The Harter fired 3 torpedoes in a tight, perfect spread. The Minazuki detonated so violently it sank in less than 4 minutes. But Dealey didn't flee the area. He remained on station, fully aware that more destroyers would come hunting. What happened next would cement the Harter's place in naval history and lead directly to its mysterious disappearance. When you're ready, send the next part and I'll continue expanding in the same style. Harter held her position and the pattern of 6 440-pound charges exploded around her like a grim metronome, each detonation sending a rattling pulse through steel and marrow alike. Pressure waves folded and refolded the hull in fractions of a second. Instruments pinged and died, and crew members, strapped in dark compartments, felt the boat shudder as if struck by a fist that would not relent. Inside, damage control parties raced along damp passageways, sounding bulkheads with hammers, patching leaks with whatever materials they could rig, while others jammed valves and swung emergency pumps into desperate life. The hiss of compressed air and the clack of ratchets competing with shouted orders that the hydrophones swallowed and translated into a mechanical roar. The Harter's electrical systems hiccuped as salt water punched through weak seals. Lights flickered into anemic pools and then into blackout, leaving men to navigate by memory and the faint glow of luminous dials. Somewhere forward, a torpedo room watch checked rotary torpedo racks and felt the cold metallic certainty of war hardware that might never be used again. On the bridge, if the bridge could still be called that at periscope depth, Dealey and his officers worked a calculus of survival, depth, angle, battery, conservation, radio discipline, while listening for the telltale motors of additional ships closing in. They had chosen to remain because every minute they stayed bought something for other Allied operations. Time. Confusion among the enemy, a sliver of strategic advantage that cannot be tallied in tons sunk. But choice and consequence are swift companions at war. The next pattern of charges found the Harter in a slightly altered trim. The keel bending, where internal bulkheads had taken the brunt, and a seam in the forward battery compartment finally gave. Battery acid began to mingle with seawater. A chemical hiss and the ghostly sheen of sulfuric breath mixing into the already claustrophobic air. Men in the forward compartments began to cough. The medics worked with cloths and injections in old training, and the smell of overheated insulation and scorched rubber crept through vents. Radios, the last link to command, stuttered and then offered a single ragged transmission, garbled, compressed, the human voice reduced to code and static. The logs taken later from Japanese sources recorded weak signals and intermittent Morse, but nothing that mapped cleanly to the calm, measured reports Dealey had used earlier in the campaign. It was enough, though, enough to tell a distant command that their sacrifice had not been for naught, that other pieces were in motion. As flooding progressed, compartments were intentionally isolated, watertight doors slammed on pumps and men alike. Multiple accounts from submariners who later analyzed the wreckage say the Harter maintained positive buoyancy longer than a boat, with critical hull breaches should have. That implies deliberate counterflooding and trim adjustments. Practiced procedures executed under duress by sailors who had done them 100 times. But it also implies time to make choices, to organize, to protect particular compartments, and perhaps preserve records or artifacts deemed vital. At some point, no one alive can say exactly when the boat slipped below effective periscope depth, and the world outside became a deep, gray pressure that no human throat could sing through. Instruments that might have recorded those last minutes were silenced by seawater, and the voices that could explain them were sealed behind bulkheads that the sea had come to claim. In the wake of the attack, Japanese escorts conducted the standard search on kill routine, dropping patterned charges and circling the last known position until fuel, time, or the demands of other engagements forced them to depart. To the Japanese, the Harter was another casualty removed from the game of fleet maneuvers. To the Americans, she was overdue. When the Harter failed to return and no survivors were available to tell the story, Naval Command filed operational reports, adjusted patrol tactics, and moved on in a war that required attention to many threads at once. Post-war investigations and interrogations pieced together fragments, decoded intercepts, Japanese action reports, and the Harter's own thin paper trail that hinted at extraordinary bravery and equal tragedy. Men like Dealey were lionized in dispatches, medals were recommended, and the name Harter entered the whispered lexicon of submariners as both a caution and a legend. Yet, decades of searches turned up little more than echoes, fruitless sweeps, sonar pings that resolved into benign topography, and rumors told on bar stools. The sea is a patient archivist. It rearranges and hides as carelessly as wind buries footprints. That is why the 2024 images from autonomous vehicles surprised archaeologists and veterans alike. Here was a keel that had not been scattered, a conning tower standing as if on parade, hatches shut and lockers sealed. The kind of preservation that invites both scientific inquiry and moral restraint. Examination of the hull from afar revealed classic signs of depth-charge trauma, where the outer plating was bent inward and plating seams were strained. But also localized areas of control room impact consistent with internal countermeasures, places where the crew had bought structural time by sacrificing non-essential compartments. Those patterns tell a human story as much as a technical one. Men who refuse to abandon their post until they had done what they could for the mission and for each other. Which returns us to the uncomfortable moral question that now confronts researchers and the Navy. What do we do with a war grave lying more than 3,000 feet down? There are voices who argue for immediate forensic retrieval, for the scientific and historical value of opening sealed compartments and reading the final logs and signals. There are others who insist on leaving the Harter intact out of respect for the 17,900 souls entombed within. That debate sits atop another layer of complexity. Modern forensics can tell us about structural failure and the sequence of events in a way that wartime reports could not. But it can never recover the lived moments, the jokes, the precise tone of a captain issuing an order. Opening the Harter would answer technical questions about the extreme operational tempo, about possible chemical exposures or substance use that might explain the near superhuman performance recorded in patrol logs, and about whether any deliberate actions such as scuttling sensitive documents or disabling classified equipment occurred before the final flooding. It might also offer closure to families who have carried uncertainty for generations. Yet each answer would be paid for by the desecration of a sealed resting place. Meanwhile, the wreck itself continues to speak in a different language. The intact electronics racks tell of sudden electrical failure. The position of the periscope suggests a final upwards glance toward the sky, and the arrangement of life jackets and boots in bunks implies calm, ordered abandonment rather than panicked flight. Those small signals add texture to the great questions. Why did they stay? What were they trying to protect? And what did they say in the moments before the ocean took them? As the debate plays out in academic journals, naval committees, and the quiet council of descendants, the Harter rests in black water, a closed ledger of courage and human cost. The sea has kept its secret for 80 years, and now that we have the technology to read its pages, we must decide whether to pry them open or to let the final chapter remain as it, written by salt and pressure in the hands of those who will never tell their own story. The Harter story refuses to sit neatly in a history book, drawing in technical detail human heartbreak, ethical argument, and the slow machinery of science and each new layer complicates the last. From the moment the ROV cameras first swept the deck and returned images that matched Mare Island overhaul notes, researchers shifted from the simple satisfaction of identification to a deeper, more uncomfortable fascination. Every preserved detail periscopes extended the SJ radar mast in its offset position. The 76mm gun still lashed to its mount and ammunition. Lockers sealed suggests the shipboard choreography of a vessel that did not simply collapse into the deep, but rather attempted in those last minutes to do something specific. Whether that was to buy time for a mission objective, to preserve classified material, to sacrifice non-essential compartments to save command spaces, or to attempt an emergency surface, is still conjecture, but the physical clues point to deliberate action rather than total chaos. Technically, the wreck has been a goldmine of surface evidence. Photogrammetry and 3D modeling have allowed hull stress analysts to map buckling lines and trace the blast vectors of the depth-charged shockwaves without touching a hatch. Metallurgists can infer rates of corrosion and the relative integrity of welds, which speaks to the forces at work during sinking. And hydrodynamic modelers have used seafloor profiles to test scenarios of tumble versus controlled descent, finding that the Harter's vertical rest is statistically improbable unless active trim control continued as flooding progressed. Forensic possibilities tantalize. Inside those sealed compartments could be paper logs, wiring maps, even the last Radio King logs whose timing might be cross-referenced against Japanese action reports to reconstruct a minute-by-minute endgame. Modern techniques, non-invasive EXOR tomography, environmental DNA sampling from disturbed sediments, trace element analysis of residues could reveal whether battery acid breached at a particular moment, whether fire or shorted circuits preceded the final flooding, or whether any chemical exposures, solvents, stimulants, or medication played a role in keeping a crew functioning under extreme stress. Yet every method that could pry answers from the wreck collides with a moral and legal framework that protects it as a designated war grave under international law. The Harter is treated as a resting place, and many descendants and ethicists argue that the sanctity of the dead outweighs the historians' or scientists' curiosity. That debate is not abstract. It is lived and raw in meeting rooms and family kitchens. Letters from relatives speak of long, unfulfilled rites, anniversary visits, to memorials, and a consuming need for narrative closure that science might offer. While others in the same families insist the men deserve the dignity of undisturbed rest. The Navy and heritage authorities find themselves balancing competing obligations. Respect for the war dead, the public interest in historical truth, the chance to learn lessons that might protect sailors today, and the international diplomatic implications of disturbing a foreign seabed. Practical considerations are formidable. Two deep-sea operations are expensive, technically complex, and risky. Recovery of organic material after 8 decades is uncertain, and any intervention risks damaging fragile evidence or provoking the ire of nations and descendants. Meanwhile, the wreck continues to speak in the language of objects. The apparent attempt at emergency surfacing implied by the open bridge door, the arrangement of boots and life jackets, and the sealed ammunition lockers combine into a portrait of a crew making choices under pressure. They may have attempted to surface to save the boat or to protect classified material. They may have sealed compartments in the hope of localizing flooding. They may have sacrificed forward spaces to keep command alive. And those tactical choices reveal a unit culture that prized mission over self and trained till the muscle memory of damage control became reflexive. That culture is part of the moral puzzle. What obligation does an institution have to relieve the effects of such sustained operational tempo? And how does wartime necessity justify pushing human limits? The Harter's patrol logs, crew manifests, denied rotation requests, and medical notes that surfaced in archival research hint at operational decisions made far from the hull. Superiors who valued aggressive interdiction, policies that prioritized immediate strategic goals, and perhaps an institutional blind spot about cumulative stress. To historians, these administrative threads matter as much as blast patterns because they trace causation from policy through leadership to the final fatal tableau on the seabed. The discovery has also reopened debates about how we tell wartime stories. Are we content with heroic narratives that simplify risk and sacrifice? Or do we accept more complicated accounts that include exhaustion, moral ambiguity, and institutional responsibility? For survivors and descendants, the question is intensely personal. Some want forensic answers that could explain why a father stopped writing letters or why a brother missed the next rotation. Others fear that an autopsy of the wreck will brutalize memory and convert sanctified sacrifice into a cold, technical report. Meanwhile, maritime archaeologists, naval historians, engineers and ethicists have begun to sketch multidisciplinary protocols that might, in theory, allow targeted, minimally invasive investigation techniques that prioritize in situ recording, non-invasive sampling, an exhaustive consultation with families and stakeholders before any penetration of interior spaces. Proposals include remote retrieval of select artifacts deemed critical for identification or context, stage sampling for trace residues that could be taken from outside hatches, and a binding moratorium on removing human remains unless families specifically request repatriation. Each option comes with legal hurdles, international coordination needs, and the ever-present risk that a single misstep could inflame passions and create precedent. Beyond policy and passion, the Harter draws attention to the nature of memory itself. How nations honor their dead. How technology alters what it means to remember. And how access to new evidence can both console and unsettle. In public forums, the wreck has reignited interest in the quiet professions of sailors' damage control parties, sonar operators, radio men roles that rarely headline but whose routines determine survival in undersea combat. And in academic circles, it has prompted fresh scholarship on the physiological effects of prolonged combat patrols, the sociological dynamics of tightly knit combat crews, and the ways in which institutional incentives can warp operational norms. The Harter's vertical keel on the seabed has become both a literal and symbolic pivot point. Upright, it stares back at us, a physical reminder that human choices made under pressure have consequences that outlast individual lives, and that the technology that allows us now to peer into those consequences obliges us to act with care. For many who study the wreck, the right path is painfully slow continued remote documentation, expanded archival work, careful outreach to families and descendant communities, and the development of an ethical framework that can be publicly justified. For others, the imperative is urgency. Recover what can be recovered before corrosion and currents. Erase the last fragile clues. Both impulses are rooted in a desire to honor those who served, but they diverge on what honoring truly requires answers or rest. As the debate unfolds, the Harter remains where she settled, a sealed ledger of human courage. Command decisions under fire, institutional choices, and the quiet lives folded into the business of war. What researchers have learned so far has already enriched our understanding of undersea combat and the costs it extracts. And what we choose to do next will define not only the Harter's final page, but how future generations balance the hunger for knowledge with the ethic of remembrance. Asterisk.